The wedding bells echoed faintly through the grand cathedral, a place Daniel had never imagined stepping foot in unless he was sweeping the floors as a part-time janitor. Yet here he was, standing in a tuxedo that probably cost more than his entire semester's tuition, sweat beading along his brow as he waited for the procession to begin. Daniel's hands trembled as he smoothed down the sleeves of the jacket. He was only 23, a broke student whose life had been defined by overdue rent, ramen noodles, and the constant dread of mounting student loans. And now, in a surreal twist, he was about to marry Eleanor Whitmore, a 71-year-old widow worth millions. The doors opened, and Eleanor entered with the confidence of someone who had lived 1,000 lives. She was dressed in an elegant ivory gown that draped perfectly, her silver hair pinned into a regal bun, and diamond earrings catching every ray of light. The guests gasped, not because they hadn't seen Eleanor before, but because she carried herself with such presence that she seemed ageless. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes locked on Daniel's. He forced a smile, though the pit in his stomach grew deeper. The whispers began almost immediately, the kind that snake through a crowd no matter how hard the priest tries to command silence. "Is he her grandson?" one voice murmured. "No, that's her groom. He's 20-something, another whispered. "Must be after the money," came the scoff from the back pew. Daniel pretended not to hear, but each word felt like a stone thrown at his chest. He reminded himself of the deal. This was security, safety, and a chance to escape the crushing poverty that had defined him. Eleanor had chosen him, pursued him even, after met in the university library where she'd been funding a scholarship program. She had approached him like no one ever had. Direct, charming, full of promises of a life he could never dream of affording. The vows were exchanged under a stained guindo casting rainbow colors across their joined hands. Eleanor's voice was steady, commanding, almost theatrical as she promised loyalty and partnership. Daniel's words, rehearsed the night before, came out shaky, but Eleanor squeezed his hand with surprising strength, as though reminding him to stay on script. When the priest finally declared them husband and wife, Eleanor leaned in for the kiss. Daniel's lips barely brushed, but the crowd still reacted, some clapping politely, others raising brows, a few even rolling their eyes. The reception was held in one of Eleanor's sprawling estates, a mansion that looked more like a museum. Daniel wandered through gilded halls lined with oil paintings of long, dead ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow him. Guests drank champagne poured by white-gloved waiters and dined on lobster and filet mignon while Daniel nervously picked at his plate, stomach too knotted to eat. Eleanor glided through the crowd, laughing, touching shoulders, giving commands like a queen holding court. Daniel couldn't help but nuverence and fear. With enjoying yourself, darling?" Eleanor asked as she slid into the seat beside him, her perfume sharp and intoxicating. "Wheeze? Of course." She leaned in close, her lips brushing his ear. "Remember, appearances matter more than truth. People will doubt us, mock us, maybe even hate us. But let them. We live above their rules now." Her words dripped with certainty. And though Daniel nodded, something about her tone sent a chill through him. Later that night, as they drove away from the party in a Rolls-Royce with leather seats so soft it felt like sinking into clouds, Daniel stared out the tinted window at the flashing city lights. His reflection stared back, a boy who had suddenly been thrust into the life of a man. Eleanor placed a manicured hand on his knee and whispered, "You'll learn quickly that money doesn't just buy comfort. It buys control." Daniel forced a nervous laugh, unsure if she meant it as a joke. Her expression didn't change. The words echoed in his mind, louder than the hum of the car engine. He thought of the whispers in the cathedral, the scrutinizing stares at the reception, the way Eleanor commanded every room she entered. He told himself it didn't matter. He had made his choice. He was free from debt, from hunger, from the constant fear of eviction. But even as the car wound up the long driveway to the mansion where he would now live, he couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's words weren't a promise of security, but a warning. The gates closed behind them with a metallic clang, sealing Daniel into a new life that felt less like a fairy tale and more like a gilded cage. When the staff greeted them at the door, rows of silent servants bowing as Eleanor swept past, Daniel hesitated on the threshold, staring up at the towering chandelier that glittered above the marble foyer. He had never seen so much wealth compressed into one place. Eleanor turned back and smiled, extending her hand to him. "Welcome home, husband." Daniel took her hand and stepped inside, but somewhere deep in his chest, unease gnawed at him. Something about Eleanor's smile, radiant and flawless, seemed to hide a shadow just beyond his reach. 7 days later, he would understand exactly what that shadow was. The 7th night in Eleanor's mansion was the first time Daniel truly felt alone. The house was far too quiet, despite its dozens of rooms, its endless hallways, and the muffled footsteps of staff who moved silently like shadows. At dinner, Eleanor had been distracted, eating almost nothing, answering his questions herself early with the words, "Business matters, darling." Then she had disappeared into her private study, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her. Daniel sat at the enormous dining table long after the plates were cleared, staring at the polished surface until his reflection blurred. His thoughts spun. For 7 days, he had tried to play the part of the dutiful husband, smiling beside Eleanor as she hosted charity events, touring gardens with her acquaintances, and even letting the tabloids capture photos of their romantic outings. Every moment felt rehearsed, orchestrated, as if he were an actor in a play he hadn't agreed to audition for. Tonight, with Eleanor locked away, he felt a strange pull, a mix of boredom, curiosity, and something darker, a gnawing suspicion he couldn't quite name. He rose and wandered the mansion's corridors. The place was intimidating, its walls lurks of Eleanor's ancestors, stern men and elegant women staring down at him as though he were an intruder. The carpets muffled his footsteps, but the silence pressed down on him, making each creak of the wooden floorboards sound like a gunshot. He passed by the billiards room, the conservatory, the library he'd only peeked into once. Every door opened smoothly, revealing spaces meant to impress. But then he reached one that was different. It was tucked at the end of a narrow hallway he hadn't explored before. The door was thick, reinforced with metal edging, and unlike the others, it had a keypad lock mounted beside the frame. He frowned, reaching out to touch it. Why would Eleanor need a locked room in her own house? He remembered how she'd vanished into her study earlier, locking the door behind her. Was this where she kept the real business she mentioned? Daniel was about to turn back when he noticed the latch. It wasn't shut all the way. The door hung just slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. His pulse quickened. He hesitated, imagining Eleanor catching him snooping. The thought of her cold, sharp smile and the weight of her words, "Money buys control," was a curiosity one. He pushed the door open and slipped inside. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of dozens of monitors lining the walls. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The screens displayed live feeds from all over the mansion, the front gates, the gardens, the kitchens, the hallways, even the bedroom he shared with Eleanor. He stumbled back, heart racing, as he realized what he was looking at. The house was covered in surveillance cameras, every inch of it monitored, recorded. There was no privacy, no corner of the estate unobserved. He thought back to every whispered phone call he'd made, every restless night tossing in bed, every private moment he believed he'd had. Eleanor had been watching all along. On the desk in front of the monitors lay a stack of files. Daniel's hand trembled as he reached for the top one, a leather-bound folder stamped with gold lettering future spouse agreements. His throat went dry. He opened it slowly, pages crackling under his fingers. Inside were photographs, young men in tuxedos smiling at weddings, much like his own only a week ago. Each file contained personal details, age, background, financial struggles, and notes in Eleanor's neat handwriting. Daniel scanned one page and froze. At the bottom, stamped in red, were the words "terminated 14 months." His stomach flipped. He flipped to the next file. Another smiling groom, another list of notes. Again at the bottom, months. Daniel's breath grew ragged as he rifled through the stack. Dozens of men. All young, all poor, all seemingly rescued from hardship by marrying Eleanor. And all of them gone within a year. His hands shook so violently that one of the folders slipped from his grasp, spilling photographs across the floor. The images stared up at him. Faces eerily similar to his own, hopeful, nervous, unsuspecting. A cold sweat broke across his forehead. He tried to piece it together. Were these marriages staged? Were these men chosen, groomed, married, and then what? Disposed of? The word itself clawed his brain. The wealth, the power, the control. Was this how Eleanor maintained it all? By cycling through desperate young men who had nowhere else to turn. Behind him, the door creaked. Daniel spun around, heart slamming against his ribs. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the dim hole. Prized. If anything, she looked almost amused. "Curiosity," she said softly, stepping into the room. "Viz both," Daniel stammered, words catching in his throat. What is this? Who are these men? What happened to them?" Eleanor's eyes glittered in the glow of the monitors. She walked past him slowly, gracefully, her hand brushing over the back of his chair before she picked up the folder he'd dropped. She gathered the photos with practiced ease, as though this had happened before. "Those," she said calmly, "were mistakes." Her tone was flat, almost bored, but it chilled Daniel to his core. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the cables snaking along the floor. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his body felt frozen, locked in place by Eleanor's presence. "You were different," she continued, turning her gaze on him. "Smarter. I had hoped." She trailed off, lips curling into that same enigmatic smile she'd worn at the altar. "But perhaps I was wrong." Daniel's knees felt weak. He thought of the portraits in the hall, of the whispers at the wedding, of Eleanor's words about control. All the pictures crashed together in his mind, forming a picture so terrifying he could hardly breathe. He wasn't her husband. He was her next experiment. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then Eleanor leaned closer, her voice low, almost tender. "You have 7 days behind you, Daniel. Do you think you'll make it to 30? His blood turned to ice. Every instinct screamed that he had to get out, but even as he edged toward the door, Eleanor's smile followed him, unshakable, as though she already knew the ending to a story he had only just begun to read.